evening, everybody. Welcome to the East Tennessee History Center. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor, the President and CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society. I'd like to welcome everybody in this evening. We're really excited about our talk tonight, which goes along with our exhibition, I've Endured, which is actually coming down soon. When's it coming down, Adam? Yeah, so if you've not seen it, now's your chance to see it. It's coming down Sunday. A few things before we get started, a few housekeeping things. To those of you that came here at noon, I'm very sorry. We had a misprint in Newsline, and it was supposed to be set for now at 5:30. Not noon. You can blame Ken. He's at the back. I encourage you to hit him on the way out. That's a joke. I would also like to thank our sponsors for this evening, the Friends of the Library and Knox County Public Library, as well as Friends of the Library, who helped sponsor us and sponsor this talk. And I should also say we have some events that are coming up here at the center. One is on April 29th, we'll be doing a talk called Bacon, the History of the Nation's Most Desirable or Undesirable Food. We'll be having a fundraiser for Knoxville History Project's own Jack Neely at Biscuits and Bubbly on May 3rd. And then finally, on May 5th, we'll be having our annual meeting of membership as well as our awards of excellence. Anyone who's a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society is welcome to come to that and to participate. So, without further ado, I'll move on to our speaker. I'm very excited to hear about this. I know very little about the banjo, but some things about the banjo. Our speaker is Kristina Gaddy, I hope I'm saying that right, who also, I've just found out, is doing her PhD at the University of Nottingham, where I did my PhD, which is very exciting. She is an author of many books, and I'm very excited to hear her discuss her latest book, The Well of Souls, Uncovering the Banjo's Hidden History. So without further ado, Kristina Gaddy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really fun to be here. I will say I have seen this exhibit at two other locations, both at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum and in Baltimore at the Creative Alliance. And this is the best setup of all of these. So even if you have seen it already, go and really soak it in, because I'm not sure it's going to get better than it is. And the banjo's tuned, so the jam is possible. When Lisa asked me about coming and speaking, I usually talk about early banjo history, but as a woman in old time, I really wanted to focus in on women in the banjo, and that kind of then ends up expanding us beyond the period that I really focus on, but it'll be fun along the way. So, like I said, what I focus on in Well of Souls is really the early banjo. So the first sighting that we have of a banjo is 1688 in Jamaica. And we get lots of descriptions of the banjo. And it's almost always in a setting like this, with musicians who are playing the banjo and a drum. You can see this guy has the little sticks and the drum between his knees, but sometimes it's a bigger drum with hands. And then people dancing, people singing a chorus to it. And in all of these descriptions and in all of these images that we have, it's almost always men playing the musical instruments and women as the singers or the kind of song leaders. That's not that weird or unusual when we think about that these were enslaved people who were taken from all over Africa, but there was a strong West African influence on these instruments. These music and dances and the instruments themselves were really products of the New World. They were already creolized, as they say. They were already kind of melding and blending, just like languages and food. And so we get this new kind of music, but there's a strong, strong West African influence. And it's now more than a few years ago. Back in 2018, I think it was, I interviewed the Senegambian kora player, Sona Jabarte. And kora is different than the banjo because it's a harp. So you play it by plucking, just by plucking. You don't fret anything or strum anything. But it's this same kind of griot tradition that some people have heard of. And that is the idea that you have people who are musicians from these musical families, and their really their vocation is to serve the kings and the royalty, and to perform these ritual functions of singing at birthdays, at weddings, at funerals. And it's both a privileged position because you have to be in this family, but it's also seen as kind of like a very working profession. But Sona Jabarte explained that the kora that she plays, which is this 18-string harp, is really a man's instrument. So her dad plays, her brothers play, and she plays. And she explained that, for her family, it's totally okay that she does this because she's not playing in these kind of ritual contexts. She's getting up on stage and playing for hundreds of people, thousands of people at folk festivals, music festivals all over the world. And so while we have this really strong tradition that would explain why women weren't playing early banjo, I also can't kind of deny that there might be a record somewhere that I haven't found yet of a female banjo player in this period, kind of from the 1680s through the 1820s. This is a later photo than the 1820s, but in the 1820s, that's when white folks really start picking up the banjo and playing it in big numbers. We get the rise of blackface minstrelsy. We have all of these traditions that are now books that'll teach you how to play the banjo. You have sheet music that'll explain what a tune, how to play the tune. And one of the first big names for female banjo players is Lotta Crabtree. And some people kind of give her a little bit of credit for elevation of the banjo and making it, again, even in those situations on stage, those were mostly men playing not very often did you have female blackface performers in that early period. But Lotta Crabtree comes in, she starts learning the banjo. She becomes very popular, very well known across the country. She's based in California, and she gets really quite rich from her banjo playing and making this name for herself. But it is also then well known that there is a female banjo player, and there's a panel in the other room that says representation matters. And this is, true even back then when people saw Lotta Crabtree playing banjo. They understood, okay, women can play the banjo too. This is not just a man's instrument. I can do this. I can become well known for it. So we do get, even in this early period, women, including Lotta, who are playing the banjo. We also have women who we don't know because there's no name on the photograph, or they were never, famous to the level of Lotta Crabtree. And this is a photograph that's probably from the 1880s, if I would have to guess. It's in the collection of my friend Jim Bowman, and a lot of the photos that I'm using today are from him. When this exhibit was in East Tennessee, in Johnson City, we had an event called the Banjo Gathering that coincided with it, and Jim is the foremost collector of banjos in the United States, I think, although a couple of his friends might argue with that, who also collect lots of vintage banjos. But Jim has just an amazing collection, and so he ended up scanning tons of his photographs that he had of women playing banjos, playing in string bands, holding banjos for us to kind of just have a slideshow during the event. And luckily they were all on my computer, so I could use them for this, with appropriate credit, of course. But so the question with this photograph might be, the woman's not playing it, so is it a memento of her husband, perhaps, who was a player. We don't really know, and I would love to know so much more about this woman and who she was, but it requires more detective work in the future. Around that same time, 1870s, 1880s, we also get the banjo kind of emerging on stage. These were two women who have names attached to them, which means that we can in fact go and kind of look them up on various other digitized databases, newspapers, other archives to see, okay, who were they? I think Teresa Vaughan probably was a banjo player and used that as part of her stage act, because almost every photo of her, she has a banjo. And so you can kind of see that this is very theatrical. She's in a costume, this kind of loose, maybe peasant-like shirt, kind of a torn, ragged dress there. Yet quite a fancy banjo, to be honest, that doesn't kind of match the rest of her costume. But this was the idea that women were playing the banjo on stage. They were using it as part of their theatrical acts. Myra Goodwin was an actress around the same period, and while she has a banjo, she's holding, a specific chord. She looks as though she's trying to play with her right hand. I'm not sure that she played the banjo, because in looking up records of her, it feels like maybe this was just a stage prop or kind of one of her publicity photos where she said, oh, I can play the banjo if you want me to, but wasn't known for it. But again, this was a period of kind of increased visibility of the banjo, but it's still associated with the stage and performance, which was not necessarily very refined, right? These are professional women who are putting themselves out there on stage, and that's not necessarily seen as maybe a very ladylike thing to do all the time. And of course, Myra Goodwin there wearing pants, which would be very unusual for the era. So I have a lot of more mysteries and questions about her that I would love answered. But this is also, starting then in the 1890s, again, you get this representation of women and a yearning of wanting to play the banjo, even if it has these kind of bad associations previously with blackface minstrelsy as being very low class, even with the stage being kind of low class. And this was really a fun find. I was at Smith College up in Massachusetts doing research on William Lloyd Garrison's family. He was the most prominent, probably white abolitionist in the United States, and had a child and a daughter-in-law that I was writing about. And I'm sitting in the reading room and I overhear one of the archivists talking about a photo of a banjo club. And I immediately go over and want to know more and want to see what they're talking about. And then, of course, very appropriately, one of the archivists says to me, "Is this what you're supposed to be working on?" It was not what I was supposed to be working on. I had about 6 boxes of Garrison family papers in front of me for a completely different project, but I knew I had to come back to it. And so they preserved some of the photographs and some of the invitations and things for Smith College's Banjo Club. And it turns out that this was a very common club for the new college women to have. So you have to remember that, not long before this, women weren't being accepted to colleges. Then you start seeing, these women's colleges like Smith College form and come into being. And here we have this whole spread of the college girl in music and drama. This was a series of articles about like what are women doing at college? Like what could they possibly be up to there? And of course they're up to all the same things that men are up to at college, because the banjo orchestras were very popular even at men's colleges at the same time. I thought one of the interesting things, again, when I showed this to Jim Bowman, was talking about the very specific instruments that these women were playing, and they're much more plain in their design than the men's banjos for the banjo clubs of the era. So the women kind of have the base model with the least amount of inlays on the fingerboard. She has a little star in hers, but most of them don't have any sort of inlay in the peg head. And whereas if you look at like Harvard College's banjo club, the men have extremely, extremely ornate instruments. But they definitely wanted to play the banjo, and so they formed this banjo club at Smith College, but they also formed them at women's colleges across the country in the era. So if there was a women's college that was around 1890 to kind of 1910, very, very likely they had either a banjo club or a banjo mandolin or banjo mandolin guitar club. And I have to say that even during this time, the banjo kind of doesn't lose its association with this kind of previous untoward history, I would say. So you have, this is a Victorian era. Everything's supposed to be very, covered up, lots of clothing, very formal, and yet you have the woman on the left here. The caption for that one is Idle Moments, where she's reading a newspaper that says music and drama and has her banjo there, and is, in a little bit of an inviting pose, perhaps. And then on the right, this idea of that scene is supposed to, again, be at a women's college, of the women kind of acting very, outre, having a good time. She's laughing and playing the banjo while sitting on furniture and has her feet up. So we still get this very kind of fun, loose association with the banjo, if you will. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later about we're going to listen to a music clip of what these women would have been playing. But basically in this era, after Lotta Crabtree is still playing a lot of that 1850s, 1860s, minstrel music, including Stephen Foster, Oh Susanna, those types of tunes, even the ones that have to do with westward expansion. But then what starts happening in this era is that you get banjo manufacturers who want to elevate the banjo. And so they start making instruments that, instead of being used for that kind of minstrel music, are essentially playing actual classical music that's been transposed onto the banjo, but then also these very notey, complex things that are not played, old times, usually claw hammer, downstroking, sometimes it's two finger, but this is a picking style that, if you saw somebody do it today and you didn't know, it would look a lot more kind of like bluegrass three finger than it would claw hammer. And so that's what these women are playing, these kind of elaborate compositions, multiple part harmonies, really treating it like an orchestra. And Alice Keller Fox was in this same period. So the 26th one is obviously later, and I'm going to have to read that because it's really fantastic. But Alice Keller Fox was born in 1880. She marries a dentist in 1902, but not that soon, but about 10 years after that, She has a pretty acrimonious divorce from this said dentist, who claims that she did not reveal everything about her kind of stage career, basically accuses her of having like loose morals and not being a good wife because she's a banjo player and has been like kicked out of musical troupes. So in 1909, we have this great kind of little clip of her from the newspaper. The star attraction of the evening was the banjoist, Mrs. Alex Keller Fox, who lived up to her reputation as the foremost lady banjoist of the world. She draws tones from the instrument which are not commonly supposed to exist. She also gave several songs in a sweet soprano voice accompanying herself on the banjo, and was most generous in responding to encores, giving in all 9 numbers. And then she's also in California, in San Francisco. And so, about 15 years after that, she gives a great little note to the newspaper Crescendo, which follows music news and music happenings. And she says, "Gentlemen, I have a scrapbook filled with Crescendo notices. I used to send them in every month, but the last 3 years have neglected this as I was so busy making money that I did not take the time to notify the magazines of my doings. I have made a fortune in teaching and expect to retire someday and take a 2-year trip around the world. I'm not 40 yet, so I have a little time. My stage and vaudeville work was done 20 years ago when a young girl in my teens. I played here 12 weeks, got married, and have been teaching ever since." So she's very accomplished. The newspaper notes that this note from her that she has arranged 75 classical pieces for the banjo and has this like large body of pupils that she's teaching. And so I think that of the era, maybe one could call her America's greatest lady banjoist. I thought that she was a good or interesting kind of comparison to Cora Merrill, who kind of straddles that mid-19th century to the late 19th century period. Under her name, it says Negro Hymns and Banjo Solo, which I take to mean that she was performing gospel songs on the banjo kind of in the 1880s at the same time as perhaps the Fisk Jubilee Singers were gaining notoriety. And she even composed her own hymn, Someone is Praying for You. And so perhaps she played that on banjo and sang as well. But so that's really just to show kind of the range of styles that these women were choosing to play in. This was another great photo that I don't know enough about. So this is probably 1909. Or a little bit earlier. We know that the man in the photo is named Seth Weeks, and he was actually primarily a mandolin player playing in this kind of classical style that was so popular right at the turn of the century. He had a wife named Carrie, who he had a daughter named Hazel with. And Seth Weeks moved to England in, I believe it was 1900, to go to an international mandolin competition there. And he goes and he's like, "Hey, this is pretty nice. I'm going to stick around for a while." Not long thereafter, there is notice in one newspaper that his wife Carrie Weeks has passed away. And then there's another notice that says his musical partner, Carrie Jones, has passed away. And so we don't know if that's a mistake and that they got it wrong and called her Carrie Jones instead of Carrie Weeks, because he was also associated with a male player named, with the last name Jones. But then after Carrie passes away, he does marry Eleanor Jones. And so the question then becomes, is this Carrie Jones? Is it Eleanor Jones? Maybe it is Carrie, maybe Carrie Weeks and Carrie Jones are the same person, and that's her maiden name. Again, something that I would love to know much more about. There's kind of an extensive research that has been done on Seth Weeks, because he was actually very prominent in recording, both when he's in England and then when he does come back to the United States and records a lot of his music. But again, it's this kind of classical music. Sometimes it's on mandolin. I don't think there's a recording of him playing banjo. Yeah. So the first woman to record on the banjo was Shirley Spalding, who recorded for Edison. And this is a really interesting period and kind of musical time, because as we know, this is also very close to the era when the hillbilly music craze begins, and we have, for example, Samantha Baumgartner recording in 1924. And so we're going to listen to this clip just to hear kind of how different this is from, I think, what we expect banjo music of the era to be. So you can hear how incredibly technical that is. She's picking a lot with her fingers. She is doing a lot of runs up and down the fingerboard, but sounds really different than we think old-time music sounds, that we think kind of banjo music of the era should sound. And again, kind of the backup with a horn section. But that is more similar to what all of those people I'd just been talking about were playing of the era. And I should say that both Alice Keller Fox and Shirley Spalding lived into the 1960s, so they were definitely around for a long period of time. But like I said, there was also this period of community music making where it might not be totally clear from the evidence that we have of what exactly that music was. I love when these photos have names on them, because then you can start to figure out who they are. I thought this is just like a beautiful photograph of this couple sitting on a bench in a very rural setting. And we have at the bottom that it's Delbert and Wilma Robb. So in preparing for this presentation, I couldn't help but kind of go and look up, okay, who are these folks? And so Wilma Hockert was from Iowa. She was born about 1884. Wilma's mom, Jeanette, was one of the college music women that I had just been talking about from that kind of, 1880s era, and graduated from Upper Iowa University of Fayette with a music degree, and worked as a music teacher, an organist, and a pianist. So she's teaching music, but she's also, playing church music, organ and piano. In 1919, Wilma married Delbert Robb, who worked both as a carpenter and a farmer. Wilma also played violin, so there's a couple of announcements in the newspaper when she was younger that, there was a concert and Wilma gave a violin solo. And I should say they spent their time between Iowa and later Indiana. And we have this image of them with Delbert holding the fiddle and Wilma holding the banjo. In that time, in the 1920s, there was tons of square dances and kind of community music making happening in Iowa, just like there was here in East Tennessee. And so you get these notices that people are having a square dance. Unfortunately, a bunch of times they don't mention who the musicians are that are playing it. With this setup, of course, I immediately think, okay, that feels like what they should be playing. But with her mom's classical music background, I can't also say that maybe Wilma wasn't playing classical music. She's got her hand fairly far up the neck, if we want to read into that, which would have been more of a classic banjo playing style. But her right hand looks pretty claw hammer to me. So we really can't say. She also died in the 60s, 1961 in South Bend, Indiana. And I would love to, again, I get started on these things and I can't stop myself. I'd love to find out more from various local historical societies in Iowa and Indiana if they have any more information on the Robs. There's also this great photo. The caption says, Addie Fleming, Lucy and Nellie Gain, 1909 or 1910. If we're reading it across, then Addie is playing the banjo, and Nellie is holding a guitar, and Lucy in the middle there is holding a shotgun, and wearing a bowler hat. I don't really know what that means, other than it's a really cool photo. From my initial research, I think they were in Michigan, which would also explain the vast amounts of snow, but I'm not sure, so don't hold me to that. But these are some other musicians, again, clearly engaged in kind of community music making that I would love to know more about. And then we just have so many photos that are really amazing that we don't have any sense of where it is or who the folks in the photo are. I think, with this one, kind of wooden house behind them, instruments that could have been bought anywhere in the country, pretty generic clothing, nothing that could kind of, you could pick out from that. But just an absolutely great photograph, and I would love to know more about them. But this is also to say that, even in this period, maybe 1915, I want to guess from their clothes, that, we had all-female string bands. It's not a new 21st century thing. And then there's, if you haven't seen the exhibit, there's a good amount on Samantha Bumgardner, because she was the first woman to record kind of under what we would call hillbilly records. As a brief background on that, the record industry at the time was really kind of siloing people into different genres, both based on the music they played, right? Because you don't want to put banjo on there and have it be Shirley Spalding if what you really want to listen to is Samantha Bumgardner. But at the same time, there was also a division among race where you could have a black banjo player playing essentially the same thing as a white banjo player, but the black banjo player would get put on what they called race records, and the white banjo player would get put on hillbilly records. So it was a kind of complicated process to figure out, who goes where, but it was all, intended to make this easier for consumers to buy what they wanted to listen to, even if that also meant, steering them in a direction where maybe they really did want to listen to this other music, or discriminating against musicians based on their race rather than the style of music they were actually playing. And so we can hear that's very classic kind of old time playing, downstroking with the right hand, fairly simple kind of chords being done with the left hand. Really different style of music than what we heard Shirley Spalding play. And of course that's because old time music is kind of intended to be dance music, right? It's intended to have that driving rhythm, both for square dances, but also for flat footing, buck dancing that we talk about in the exhibit too. So it's really fantastic that type of music actually got recorded, because there's so many types of vernacular music that didn't get recorded over time, especially dance music, because people just kind of didn't think that it was worth recording. And I want to end with this clip of Elizabeth Cotten, who's also kind of featured in the exhibit and even on the first image as you walk in, who was from North Carolina, but moved to the Washington, D.C. region, where the Seeger family heard her and encouraged her to keep playing music. And that was really fantastic because we got a sense of a tradition within the African American community that had never died out, despite this kind of racializing of records and saying, okay, well, if it's a black person playing, that's blues or that's jazz, rather than what Elizabeth Cotten plays, which is really old time.
She was born about 1892. Her grandmother was a slave. She was only a young thing in her 60s when she came up to Washington from North Carolina and got a job with the Seegers as a domestic help. At that time, she wasn't playing at all and hadn't done for about 40 years. Back home, the preachers had warned her about worldliness and music. The Seegers were to change all that.
Oh, Georgie Buck, oh, Georgie Buck, oh, Georgie Buck, sing so. Georgie Buck in bed, that's where you see it. Didn't want no Charlotte in the bread. Charlotte in the bread, it was right in his head.
One thing I really, so that's not that typical clawhammer downstroke playing. And in a way, it kind of reminds me of Mother Maybell's playing that, you know, you have to do, if you're a woman, you have to do the melody and the rhythm at the same time, because you can't count on anybody else to do anything for you. And that's it. I think we have plenty of time for questions. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I have a question about like Smith College and this tradition of banjo clubs at these early female schools. And I think it's so interesting how you mentioned how at this point banjo is still kind of seen as something that is not very ladylike and is kind of unfeminine. How are they able to get away with this? How is it sanctioned?
I think one way that it was sanctioned was simply that it was, you know, there was this kind of rising trend, and this general idea that, like, if guys can do it, we can do it too, right? So they're a college, we're a college. They're going to do drama, we're going to do drama. They're going to do banjos, we're going to do banjos. But I looked way more into Smith College's banjo club, and it's very interesting because I still think of it as quite subversive, the fact that they're playing the banjo. And there was even a joke, essentially a joke, in one of the graduation kind of blurbs for one of the banjo players, because these were great, where they had, they have both the yearbooks at Smith College, so you can like look through those and see who's in the banjo club. But they also had names on a bunch of these, so you could like look at the names. And you know, for some ladies, it really was just like, I'm going to Smith. That seems like a fun thing. Let me do that. For other women, I do think it was truly subversive, and that they saw a non-ladylike space that they wanted to be in, if I put it that way. So that this one yearbook had a little blurb where it very clearly makes a joke about her. She's as adept on banjo strings as she is on the heartstrings of freshmen. It's an all-women's college. That means that she is, you know, playing with the heartstrings of other women. And there was another woman who I kind of dug into a little profile of her too, and she ends up becoming a teacher in Brooklyn and never marries, you know, kind of classic story of like, leaves her, I can't remember, I don't want to say now that she was living with another woman, but like leaves all of her property to her best friend who also never married. And so those things of, you know, we can't kind of say like, oh, definitively, you know, that she was a lesbian, but that there were definitely some undertones of that in some of these women's, I think, choices to play the banjo. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So even though there's not evidence per se of women playing in African instruments, is there anything in your research that suggests within the culture at the time that sort of Africans have been taught here that would have been prohibited or awkward or different for women to play any string instruments or any instruments?
That's a great question. I will say that in that era, especially in the 18th century, which is kind of our big block of Black banjo playing, that music making for women was supposed to be a very private endeavor. For white women, was supposed to be a very private endeavor. So it was, you were playing, you know, harpsichord, later piano in this kind of very domestic setting, whereas public performance was male musicians. And so I can imagine that even as that prevailing attitude is placed on people of African descent in the Americas, that attitude sticks, right? That, okay, so this is a public dance, you know, that's okay that women are singing because women are allowed to sing. You know, it's not that different of a kind of cultural attitude than what Sona Jabarte was talking about, which is, you know, men are allowed to be out on stage and performing, and women are not allowed to be. And that is also to say that there were enslaved musicians who played for military regiments, who played fiddle for, you know, white dancers for white balls. And so the idea there being, again, that you would be cultivating the musical talent of Black men, not Black women. And that again is, you know, not really a space for Black women. So I think that I hadn't thought about it that much, but I think that could be a part of it too, was not just that African tradition, but also kind of the European tradition overlaying on it. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming, listening, and I hope you enjoyed it and learned a little something.